Once upon a time, on a cold November day in New York at the United Nations headquarters, I found myself shaking hands with a Chinese major general named Zhang, General Zhang. And I'd been sent there. I was being paid by the US government because there'd been some trouble over the previous 3 years between the Soviet Union and China. To hear the Chinese tell the story, there was a 1 million soldier buildup against China by the Soviet Union. And a mentor to David Shambaugh and myself, Alan Whiting, had written a top secret, eyes-only paper for Henry Kissinger and President Nixon. It was only recently declassified about a year or two ago. It's quite a profound paper, and it had a sobering effect on Henry Kissinger, he has admitted, because if you read Henry Kissinger's first 5 or 6 books and look in the index for the word China. Now, this is a great professor at Harvard, studies national security strategy, chosen by President Nixon to be his advisor because of his broad global grasp of strategy. How many times will you find the word China in any of his 6 books up to that point? Any offers? 100 times? Oh, someone said 0. There's cheating going on. Yes, that's the correct answer. So Alan Whiting's paper, in some sense, galvanized the thinking of the Nixon administration of what to do about China. And they had an interesting debate, which has now been only partially declassified, about what to do about it. But ultimately, the choice was made, this is our chance to work closely with China in the security area, as well as every other area. And President Nixon, who at that point, one of his greatest claims to fame had been the famous debate with Khrushchev in Moscow when he was a vice president. And so somehow in President Nixon's mind, the idea of a trip to China with television and perhaps a debate with Mao or something like that was sort of like the smartest idea he'd ever heard in his lifetime. They did it. It was a tremendous success. And to this day, scholars are trying to figure out exactly how it happened. How could this happen? And one of the most delicious quotes in the whole period, the Chinese like to tell me a lot, is Mao saying to Nixon, "I like right-wingers." But that's a whole other conference. But what came to be clear is that the Chinese were not ready at that time, in February of '72, to start military discussions with the United States, with the official world. Now, one example of why President Nixon and Henry Kissinger knew that was Kissinger slipped away while Nixon was meeting with some fairly important people himself. Kissinger slipped away in February of '72 and gave an hour-and-a-half top-secret briefing with really wonderful graphics about the Soviet military threat to China. And then he said, let's follow this up. We could meet in Paris, we could meet in Washington, and the Chinese, who should have been scared silly by the 1 million-man nuclear buildup against them, didn't really quite answer. Oh yes, what a wonderful idea. So it's very difficult to set up any kind of official talks with the Chinese military. So back to November, that cold and rainy day, I'd worked in the United Nations Secretariat, so I had a good reason for going to a wonderful reception there, the Albanian National Day. It's not usually a place where Americans turn up, but the Chinese love Albania for various complex reasons, and there was General Zhang. So we began a friendship that lasted 16 years. I met with him many, many times that first year. I would be given questions and topics to cover by the US government, and then I would write these memos I'm still very proud of. I'm trying to get them released by the US government, where I would say, at this point, General Zhang and his staff, he had many military guys come with him to these dinners, he would serve twice-cooked pork. And then he would bring up the question of the accuracy of Soviet missiles. Then I would say, at this point, they brought in the chicken with Hunan sauce and broccoli. And the topic turned to Vietnam. And people who read my memos down in Washington remembered how I had linked the dish and even the flavor with the highly sensitive security topic. This was not some crafty idea. I wanted to be able to remember what the main points were. So in my own head, I would link twice cooked pork, ICBMs. Hunan broccoli, Vietnam. And by the fourth or fifth dinner, General Zhang caught on to this, and he would say, now it's time for the broccoli. So if I had ever thought the Chinese people were not smart, all those illusions were ended in these long series of lunches and dinners with the Chinese military. So fairly quickly, Dr. Kissinger realized that General Zhang's questions, often delivered in long rhetorical proverbs and even poems, which seemed to be highly obscure at the time, about two tigers on a mountain, can be watched struggling, but third-party benefits. There's one about a mussel and a bird on the beach, and the fisherman profits because one eats the other. But slowly, even I began to grasp, when the green beans were brought out, I began to grasp people saying, you know, if the Soviet Union invades us, we'll have a hard time expelling them. And there might be a superpower around who might be willing to help us in some small way, because such a war would not be in the interest of that superpower. So Dr. Kissinger in '74, in what has also been recently declassified, had a very long conversation with Zhou Enlai and the chief of the Chinese military about establishing military cooperation between the US and China. In that case, it was about early warning. How could we provide early warning? Because their strategy at the time was to fall back. And so knowing when the invader was coming would let them mobilize their people, fall back, prepare their defenses, and they didn't have as good a warning system as we did. And so sharing it would be a step for world peace, you might say. And one thing led to another, and by the time President Carter recognized China, within the government, especially the professor at University of Michigan and Stanford and Columbia who taught David Shambaugh and myself and Elizabeth Economy and I think Professor Brown, Mike Oxenberg, by the time Jimmy Carter became president, there was already a package of ideas for how could we strengthen top secret security cooperation between the US and China once we recognize each other. And Jimmy Carter, to his eternal credit, pushed through some of these steps. In fact, Jimmy Carter and Mike Oxenberg and Professor Brzezinski established the framework for US policy toward China, which endures to this day. There's been almost no change, I would argue, from the 1979-1980 Carter-Brzezinski-Oxenberg framework. And the security cooperation continued to the point where my dear friend General Zhang and I, by the time he became the Chinese defense attaché in Washington, D.C., in 85 and 86 and 87, over shrimp and asparagus, we were now discussing how many torpedoes of what type the U.S. Navy would sell to China, which was done. The discussions also turned to, basically, it was over the beef with spinach, turned to artillery, fuses and radar, how to upgrade 50 or so of their MiG-23s so they'd be able to shoot down Soviet bombers at high altitude, which they really couldn't do very well. That, by the way, involved bringing 2 of their jet fighters to Long Island, which led to a lot of very strange truck drivers looking around Bethpage, Long Island, near the Grumman factory, had seen 2 Chinese MiGs being brought in to be worked on in the factory. This is openly. By now, everything was quite open, and the U.S. Congress, by a vote, the Senate, by a vote of 99 to 1, approved the major weapons sales to China in the 80s. So there were other kinds of security cooperation with China in the 80s that Jimmy Carter had helped to initiate in what's diplomatically called the third areas, the third countries, and one of them was Afghanistan. We cooperated very closely in Afghanistan, once again in driving the Soviets out of a country they had occupied. But it was the military and the intelligence services of both sides, both in Beijing and Washington, who were doing the nitty-gritty work. So General Zhang went home, I think something of a hero, to Beijing, and then the Tiananmen incident, as we like to say, happened. And the PLA became quite clear the Chinese military was split between those who thought it was a good idea to kill the rebels, the rebellion, and those who thought it was a bad idea, or if it needed to be done, it should be done by somebody else besides the uniformed military. And there then began a 15-year period up till today, where the relationship between the intelligence services of China and the United States, yes, they have kind of a CIA over there, and their Pentagon, such as it is, and our Pentagon began to suffer a kind of bipolar disorder, in which we would have manic moments of how friendly we all are, and we would drink wine and try to dance Chinese dances and so forth. And the next time we'd see each other, it would be over a military confrontation, such as in 1996. So I want to say a few words about how President Clinton and his advisors began to change the Jimmy Carter framework. When the Chinese fired 2 missiles over Taiwan in 96, it was a strange coincidence because the Secretary of Defense at the time, Bill Perry, had been to China 7 times, whereas the National Security Advisor of Bill Clinton had not been to China at all. So Bill Perry tended to be the one who knew China the best. He was deferred to. 7 trips. He'd done a very important trip actually in 1980, back under Jimmy Carter when he was a mere undersecretary. He'd gone over and done a long study of what weapons China needs from the United States. So Bill Perry's reaction to the firing of the missiles was quite interesting. He said it was reckless, dangerous, irresponsible, and demanded a response by the United States immediately. And lo and behold, 2 American aircraft carriers, one already there essentially and one on its way home, 2 American aircraft carriers found themselves in some sort of a threatening posture from the Chinese point of view. And that led to a review by President Clinton of U.S. defense strategy toward Taiwan and a review of what do we really know about China. And this review has not been made public, unfortunately, but 2 years later, the newspapers began to carry stories that President Clinton had told the U.S. Nuclear Forces commander, to develop nuclear options to be used to attack China. This appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and it certainly appeared in the Chinese press. Now, that's a very unfriendly gesture, isn't it? How would you like it if I said, Camden, Maine ought to be one of the nuclear targets for the Pentagon? In fact, very high up on the list. It's very offensive to say something like that, especially in the newspapers. As one Chinese general said to me, at least you can keep it secret. So there then began a series of discussions with Japan. Our mutual friend Kurt Campbell, you mentioned Joe Nye, don't turn China into an enemy. If you treat China as the enemy, they'll turn into one. All of a sudden, President Clinton began to say, we need to really reinvigorate our security treaty with Japan. And the press would say, why is that? Soviet Union's gone. No answer. So the Chinese supplied the answer. This must be about Taiwan. And sure enough, one indiscreet senior Japanese official said, all this phrase about protecting the surrounding areas of Japan, it's really about Taiwan. And the other Japanese all go, oh, no, it's not that. But there never was a good answer given. So I'm giving a lot of credit here to the Clinton administration from 96 on to doing some things which, if Mike Oxenberg were here today, unfortunately he died of stomach cancer in 2000, but if he were here today, I think Oxenberg would criticize me and David Shambaugh and the others' products he has here by saying actually in his 1979-1980 plan, he still had the idea of hedging against things going bad. Oxenberg was to some degree a sort of Henry Jackson defense-minded Democrat. And he wanted strong U.S. military forces in the Asia Pacific. So President Clinton was in some way, Oxenberg might say, just developing something that was latent. That the idea of arms sales to Taiwan and a strong U.S. Pacific force was already there. But I think President Clinton added to it, frankly. Then when President Bush came into office, and by this time I'm having many more lunches and dinners with many more Chinese generals, I'm running out of courses at this point to link to the topics, because the topics are now getting to be up to 50 or more issues. But they like to lead off always with the very same issue. From the time of President Clinton doing this in 96 on, China's peaceful rise. China's peaceful rise. Don't you know China's rise is going to be peaceful? And when you hear this for about the 3,000th time, you begin to wonder, why is he saying this to me? And when President Bush arrived in office, he, like President Clinton, had criticized the previous president. President Clinton said, George Bush, Father Bush, I think the phrase was coddling the butchers in Beijing. Coddling the butchers in Beijing. And there's a lot of stuff about how the Bush family had sort of somehow been too close to China. So when George W. Bush ran against Clinton, he had a lot of fun, saying that China is our strategic competitor and giving the impression that somehow President Clinton had sold the country, sold the furniture in the White House and sold the country to the Chinese. And by God, when his administration got in, if they did, he said during the campaign, there'd be a new approach to China. After 6 months, orders came, even for people like me, who are just every now and then going in to see the Secretary of Defense, not every day. Do not use the word competitor when you talk about China. Do not use the word competitor in public when you talk about China. I said, how about threat? And a very senior, powerful person in the Bush administration said to me, don't joke. So President George W. Bush added a new dimension. Whatever we do about China, we will not call China a competitor or a threat. And then he proceeded to expand on the Oxenberg framework. He proceeded to take roughly 16 steps in the area of strengthening U.S. forces that could be used in a war against China. Most of these ideas did not come from the Bush campaign, did not come from the Congress, came from career workers inside the U.S. government. And I won't go through all 16, and David Shambaugh mentioned some of them. But the balance of U.S. aircraft carriers, where they are in the world, we don't have a sort of a world map, but U.S. aircraft carriers have usually always been in Europe and the Mediterranean. That's been changed. Now, the majority of U.S. aircraft carriers will always be where this map shows you, although Seattle and San Diego sort of count in there. Number 2, U.S. attack submarines. And I want to thank Galen Plummer, my host here, captain, former U.S. nuclear submariner. The U.S. attack submarines, also Europe and Mediterranean, that's been changed. The majority of U.S. attack submarines will now always be in this area. Number 3, U.S. nuclear missile launching submarines. Majority against the Soviet Union or some vague post-Soviet collapse threat. Now that's been changed, transferred from Georgia to Seattle, Washington as a home base, so the majority will be in the Pacific. We used to have a Army Corps headquarters. Again, this doesn't show the state of Washington, but it's in the state of Washington. It's being moved forward to Japan. A Corps headquarters is to control an army, or to control forces in combat. B-2 bombers, the sort of pride of the U.S. Foreign policy implementation fleet, are very delicate because they have to be stored in an air-conditioned hangar, and when you repair them, you have to do all kinds of fancy things, well, you can only do with lots of backup. So it's quite unusual that Guam is being configured to handle deployment of B-2 bombers. There's some programs that the Washington Post has described. One's called the Falcon Space Plane. According to the Washington Post, Walter Pincus, it's good for shooting down satellites or protecting satellites against someone else trying to shoot them down. There's a long list. There's a set of military exercises that were never done before. The U.S. Forces in Asia Pacific did not exercise in certain ways. Now they are. A series of newspaper stories in the past year about exercises to be held that China has actually objected to. So, even though Galen Plummer told me in high school competition, when they have two debating teams over who is going to engage China over on this side and then who's going to contain China over on this side, and the engagement people always win. It looks like the hedging strategy, first laid out by the Carter administration, then expanded by President Clinton, looks like the hedging strategy is becoming more vigorous. And so those who, and I think I'll close on this thought, those who praised the Deputy Secretary of State's brilliant statesman-like speech in September in New York, which I also praise, of course, have to look at a paragraph tucked away on about the third page, which uses the word hedge. We need to hedge against China. Then it says the Defense Department's description of the Chinese military buildup is correct, and the Chinese reaction was an overreaction. Then it repeats language that the Secretary of Defense had used that says China's buildup is of concern. Frankly, there's no limit to it. That's the main problem. The Chinese do not tell you either the size of their military forces now in official publications, nor, far more important, do they say where they're going. Now, we have to do this. Most democracies have to testify in front of their parliament. Our plan is we're going to have 3 submarines added this year and maybe 2 in 2010. And then there's a big debate in the parliament. Well, should it be 2 or what? So the whole country knows the size of the military force in a democracy, and they know where it's going to go in the coming 5 years. In China, no. No debate and no limit on where it's going. So Secretary Zelek's warning is really, we have all these issues with China, he says, in most of his speech. And then he's had 3 press conferences now, too, where he says, basically, he fills in more details. He says, we have all these issues with China, intellectual property rights, and we could have, he holds out the vision of almost a marriage. That's a slight exaggeration, but almost a marriage between the U.S. and China. We 2 great countries could sort of do everything together. We could both be responsible stakeholders. But then he has this little paragraph buried away where he not only endorses what the Defense Department's been doing, but he has this wonderful phrase, and I've been searching for this speech because maybe Bob Cap has it, but he says this wonderful phrase about many countries are concerned about China, all hope for its peaceful rise, but none would bet the farm on it. And that's really what the debate is inside the U.S. government. How much to aid China, how much to help China's peaceful rise, and I'll mention just a few of what we're doing there, versus how much to hedge. And almost nobody in America would say, don't hedge at all. There might be some. Joan from the Physicians for Social Responsibility might say, take all those U.S. forces out of Asia Pacific. We don't want any of them. But generally speaking, most people want some forces as a hedge, not against China, but against many other things as well. And most want to help China's peaceful rise. But how to do the balance? Because if we're too provocative in our hedging, then we tend to compromise the chances for this marriage between the U.S. and China. And if you want to get a very excellent statement, the most recent by the State Department on our policy toward China, it was made February 3rd. It's a special assistant to the assistant secretary. It doesn't really matter because the government just sort of speaks like the Borg all in one voice, and he's speaking for the whole U.S. government. He lists what was the original, I was very touched by it. He lists the original Oxenberg plan of 25 years ago. He goes through each department of government and says what that department is doing to help China. This was the Oxenberg plan. Not just State Department, not just Henry Kissinger or Cyrus Vance, a very high-level group, but every department of the U.S. government must get involved with China, must engage with it, and must in some sense help it. It's not, don't get involved to fight with the Chinese, help them. So he runs through a list. Department of Labor, helping with the Federal Mediation Service. Department of Energy, helping China create a strategic petroleum reserve, helping China have more energy-efficient technology. National Science Foundation, more than 60 programs that transfer basically for free U.S. scientific discoveries to the Chinese. National Science Foundation just opened an office in Beijing. So each department has its program to help China, plus we've been taking half of China's exports for the last 25 years, roughly half. Some would say 40%, but roughly half. Plus, the U.S. level of foreign direct investment is usually among the highest in China. Plus, our government, for more than 25 years, has been blessing and endorsing China as a good country, good place to invest. That's worth a lot. Imagine if the opposite were happening. So we deserve a lot of credit, it seems to me, and it's very sad that the Chinese government-controlled press never expresses gratitude and says our peaceful rise is in large part due to our own efforts and our friends in America. You never see this. Same thing as Liz Economy mentioned about the Japanese foreign aid program. Never mentioned. So in the long term, do we have a problem? Yes. Am I allowed to say there's a threat from China today from this podium? No. Thank you. Okay. All right.